Hi, welcome to my channel. This is Amber Rain Davis for NotableInk.com. I'm here today with a set of 4 cards. There'll be 2 cards in this video for the Altenew Educator Certification Program Blog Hop. If you're not familiar with this program, I definitely encourage you to check it out. There are more details on this blog post, so I'll have that linked below, as well as all the products that we're going to use today. So be sure to check that out. We're going to start off with some ink smooshing with the Altenew Spring Garden watercolor brush markers. And so what I'm doing here is I have a piece of 100% cotton paper. This is a great cardstock. It's actually by Savoy. And it's not a watercolor cardstock, but I find that you can use watercolors with it as we're doing here. But also I specifically picked it because it's a great paper to tangle on, which is, we'll do a little bit of that today. So I sprayed the paper, and it's just die cut with a circle. I sprayed it with a mixture of water and Perfect Pearls, and then I just, touched on some of the brush marker. I dried it in between, and then I kind of blotted it in and ink smushed it into the leftover pigment that was on my craft mat. I knew that I wanted to tangle, so I specifically left quite a few areas of just plain white in between there so that I could tangle in those empty areas. So I'm just taking this is a Sakura Micron pen here, and I'm just going to do a grid pattern in the background. So you can see where there's colored pigment, where it's a deep rich color. I'm avoiding those areas, and this is going to make it look like that this grid pattern is behind or drawn behind all of the ink. So you kind of have to take some artistic judgment, and in some areas you are going to need to draw over the ink smushing that you've done just to make the pattern more clear. But for the most part, I'm really only going to be drawing where it's very, very light pigment or just the stark white. And so I would say my grid pattern is maybe ½ an inch. Each one of those spaces is about ½ an inch tall and wide, or ½ inch square, I guess you could say. And so I have a grid here, and then what I'm going to do is just do a curved line on both sides of each one of those lines, and I'm going to do that in both directions. So again, there's going to be areas where I won't be able to have a full pattern, so I'm going to stop it once I get to the pigmented area. So some of those lines are going to be fragmented, some will stop in the middle, some will stop before you get to the end. And so you have to think about, what does that curved line look like? So it's going to be tight on each of the tips, and then it'll bow out in the center. So it's going to be a little bit of what would kind of the shape of a grain of rice. And this Zentangle pattern does have a name. It's called Bales, B-A-L-E-S, and it's just a very simple pattern. There's a lot of different things that you can do with it to embellish it or change the appearance of it, but I'm just keeping it really simple. I also will not be shading this pattern today. So many times with Zentangle, it doesn't pop until you shade it. But there's a lot going on in this little piece of paper already, and this is going to be a backdrop for my card, so I don't really feel the shading would be necessary. So we're going to continue on with the same pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and edit some of this out so that we can move on with the rest of the card. If this is something that you're interested in, definitely stay tuned on my blog. I'm developing a class with more of these techniques, so make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss out on that class when it is available. So we're going to move on to more watercoloring. So what I've done here is I've stamped the flower and leaves from the Wispy Begonia set. Again, this is on that 100% cotton paper. You could also just use watercolor paper. And what I'm doing is I'm wetting, I stamped it and I clear heat embossed it so that I would have those edges and the wells to keep my petals more separated. But I'm still trying to not paint petals that are adjacent to each other if it is still wet. So I'm laying down some clean, clear water, and then I have some of the violet ink from the watercolor brush. I have that squeezed out on my craft mat over on the side, and I'm just dropping that into the petals. So this is the dust color watercolor brush, and I wasn't thrilled with the way that those leaves look, so I'm going to change that up a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and dry this layer of paint. And then you can see there's all of my extra ink over there, and I just decided to do some ink smooshing on it to add another layer of texture, something a little bit different. And I went ahead and put some of that Midnight Violet on the leaves as well to add some added interest, because I didn't love how that watercoloring came out. So I'm taking the dust watercolor brush there, and just straight from the brush, full pigment, I'm just flicking that on to get some darker specks. I didn't have the dies for these, so I went ahead and fussy cut them out, which was super easy for this particular shape. And there you can see that I've dry embossed an A2 sized white, just Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I dry embossed that with the square weave pattern stencil from Altenew. I went ahead and stamped Happy Birthday from the Wispy Begonia set. This stamp set has beautiful sentiments. They all have that scripty font there, also with a sans serif sub-sentiment. I just love them. They're so pretty. So here I'm just figuring out, you totally don't need to do that. You can just eyeball that and cut it off. I don't know why I was trying to be so precise. But I'm going to adhere the ink smush panel directly to this dry emboss panel. And if you've never dry embossed with a stencil before, it's super easy. You just need a soft, it's kind of like a soft rubbery embossing pad. I know that Spellbinders makes them. I'll have that linked below. And then you just have to play around with your particular die cutting machine to figure out what the correct sandwich is. For me, I have to do it on plate number 1, and I put down a cutting plate, then both of the embossing pads, then my piece of cardstock. I put the stencil on top of it, another cutting plate on top, and then I run it through. And that seems to be the right amount of pressure to where it's not going to crack my cardstock, but also gives me a deep enough impression that you can see the detail and what's going on. If your sandwich is too tight, you're going to pierce your paper, you're going to get cracking, it's going to tear, it's not going to look great. So just play around with what your sandwich is, and then maybe write that down so that you don't have to figure it out every time. Sometimes what I'll do is just print it out with my label maker and stick it right on the packaging of whatever I'm going to use. Like I'll do that with my embossing folders, because sometimes those can be different. So for my sentiment there, I felt like the sentiment strip looked really plain, and so I decided to do some ink smushing on that. I put that on there, and it was just, I spent a good amount of time on that little backdrop there, and I thought it was so pretty. I felt like the sentiment strip, because it's so big, was just taking up and covering too much space. So what I decided to do was fussy cut out both birthday and happy into 2 separate sentiments, and we'll go ahead and pop that up on the card. So we'll fast forward through this. So everything's fussy cut, and you can see that I put some dimensional squares on the back of the leaves and the flower. So when I'm arranging my leaves and flower, oftentimes I'll just use regular tape or washi tape or something like that to adhere the leaves to the flower. And I'll just leave that on there, and then I'll throw on my dimensional tape to that. That way I don't have to keep fussing around with the group and getting them exactly how I want over and over. So I decided I'm going to have both the leaves and the flower popped up, and then I'm going to go ahead and pop up that sentiment as well. So there's that card finished, and I love how it turned out. We're going to move on to the second card. So this card features Ruffled Flowers, which I think is a beautiful stamp set. I just love the clusters of these flowers. I love any kind of stamp set or layering set where there's white left in the petals, where the entire petal isn't completely covered. And oftentimes if I have a layering stamp set where there's a complete solid layer. Sometimes I omit that one so that I can leave some white space. So I used Volcano Lake and Dusk on these flowers that I'm fussy cutting here, and I used Midnight Violet and Dusk on the other cluster of flowers. And that is one of the things that I absolutely love about Altenew, is that all of their colors coordinate. So here that you can see, I'm going to go ahead and dry emboss another panel, this time with the Wavy grid stencil, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp a sentiment, and I think I clear emboss it. I stamped it a couple times to make sure I had a good impression, and I will trim these into strips instead of fussy cutting them. So like I said, I love how all of the colors coordinate together from medium to medium. So in this case, the watercolor brush markers, and then also the ink pads. And I love how the ink pads come in, each color family has 4 different shades of that color. But the other thing that I really like to do, that I did in these flowers, is mix up those sets. So, you know, the second layer was done in Dusk for both of these flower clusters, but the first layer was done in completely different colors that were outside of the color family for Dusk. You know, we used Midnight Violet and then Lagoon. And I think if you experiment with some of your colors, you can get such unique combinations for the layering stamp sets, you know. And if you look at flowers in nature, they're not all of the same color family necessarily. You know, you might have a tiger lily that has yellows and oranges and also some fuchsia in there, or some deep reds or things like that. So you can get a lot of unique looks and stretch your supplies just by trying out different color combinations. So again, I'm popping up both of the sentiments and the flower clusters. I went ahead and decided to leave the leaves just completely white. I thought that that would look really nice with the dry embossed white background, and just break up the color a little bit. I felt like if I stamped those in a color, there would have been too much going on. So I'm just working with the sentiments, making sure I get them straight, and I absolutely love these. Might be some of my favorite cards that I've made so far. I just love how all of them came out, and all of the colors, the color combinations, I love. So here's how the card turned out. I opted not to add any additional embellishments to any of these cards, and I did add a drop shadow with this Zentangle pattern on that circle. And I just love all the texture and the interest between the ink splattering, the dry embossing, the hand-drawn details. I think that these just are so fun. So I hope this is a technique that you will give a try. Like I said, stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel here and to my blog and Instagram account so that you don't miss out on any announcements on upcoming classes. And I hope that you will come back and visit again soon, and that you'll give some of these techniques a try. I've added some links to some other videos at the end for you to check out as well. Thanks so much for stopping by, and have a great day.